Hello friends, welcome to the Reset Network. Our today's topic of discussion is urbanism in Indian culture, and for this discussion we have thus in our studio our subject expert Dr. Shankar Kumar, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Hindu College, University of Delhi. His teaching and research experience is over 16 years and his specialization is Ancient Indian History and History of Medicine. Also among the books published by him includes Indian History and Culture, published in 2013 along with Jaya Tyagi, and he was also a member of the Empowered Committee on Indian History and Culture to devise its syllabus at the University of Delhi. And with this introduction I would like to welcome sir and request him to begin our today's lecture. Thank you for coming, sir.
Thank you, Urvashi, and good morning viewers. As stated, we would be talking about urbanism in Indian culture today, and in the previous couple of discussions that I had with you, we already have defined as to what we mean by culture, because the earlier two discussions were also veering around Indian culture, of course in a different context altogether, which was ecology. And today we shall be talking about urbanism. As the name itself suggests, urban is having a connotation which of course kept changing over a period of time. Nevertheless, there are some basics, structural facts about an urban center ever since we as Indians got to experience as to what constituted urban life or what constituted an urban center. And it is with reference to this experience, continued experience through Indian history, that we can think of defining an urban center. To begin with, let's talk about the structural aspects, the physical structural aspects of an urban center. Most of us identify an urban center with a delimited space, which is of course in terms of civic amenities far superior as compared to other habitation sites, be it rural or semi-rural or semi-urban. The roads, the houses, the shops, the commercial activities, the exchange, trade, etc., the services which are rendered. So all these things go on to constitute what we today understand as the popular kind of conceptualization or popular visualization of an urban center. But in structural terms, as we said, that it has to have a minimum degree of civic amenities, it has to have buildings, and in Indian history, like one can say as to when did this notion of calling a particular habitation site as an urban center or as something very distinct from other habitation sites begin. Now, the only insight that we can get in historical terms is from the earliest times when we got to know about the cities of Harappan civilization. So Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Lothal, Kalibangan, Banavali and so forth, they are all regarded as urban centers in Harappan times, and of course their visual look, their physical look was certainly quite different from the look that other habitation sites in the contemporary times bore. Now, what were those physical features? Of course, we tend to identify Harappan towns and cities with burnt brick structures of which the houses were made of, very planned layout of the city in terms of drainage as well as the roadways. We are told that the roads intersected each other at right angles, and so that tells us about the foreplanning in laying out the city. Also important is the fact that the perimeter of the settlement area that constituted a distinct habitation site referred to as town was walled. Of course, in some of the cities of Harappa, this might not always hold true, but in most of the settlements, it was encircled, it was enclosed by a thick wall. In some centers, only certain portion which constituted the elite portion or the raised platform portion of the city had the perimeter surrounded by a wall, and in some other cities, entire city along with the upper town and the lower town, both were surrounded by concrete walls. When I say concrete walls, it basically the connotation is that of brick walls. Now, of course, this gives us an inkling of a different kind of settlement, and the fact that it was encircled, of course, it could have been on account of aesthetics, that it looked beautiful. It could have also been on account of the fact that there was a fair degree of prosperity and wealth in that area, and therefore it needed to be protected, and therefore the walls were raised. So these are different propositions raised by historians in order to understand the meaning behind such structures. Also important is the fact that while defining urban, we must keep in mind that there is a very fundamental difference between an urban center and a rural area or non-urban area, and that is that urban population necessarily is not dependent on agriculture in a direct way. So they are non-producers, non-agricultural producers. They are either engaged in service pursuits or in manufacturing pursuits, certainly not in direct agricultural pursuits. So it could be trade, commerce, it could be manufacturing of something, or it could be physicians, it could be priests, it could be military persons, police persons, or other part of the state bureaucracy and so forth. And that means that since food is a basic requirement for sustenance of such a large population, therefore there must have been some kind of a mechanism to ensure that food reaches these people, and that mechanism was market, and through trade and commerce these things reached the urban centers, so that people not engaged in agricultural pursuits also are able to survive and sustain themselves and so forth. Now, since the grains are necessarily coming from the other areas, that is hinterland areas, therefore again a structural necessity of particularly ancient towns, and this is something that you can see even in the present day towns. In a city like Delhi also, we find that particularly on the fringes of the city, we have huge vertical silos to store grains, and that is these structures are there just to ensure constant regular supply of grains to such a huge population, urban population, to ensure the supply of grains. Now this is why that even in the Harappan times, you must have read in your school books that Harappa had granaries, great granaries. Similarly, Mohenjo-daro also had huge structures which probably was used for storing grains and so forth. And that tells us about the structural requirements for a city. Of course, in the modern times, these structural requirements keep changing. For instance, water supply as a part of civic amenity is something that we get to hear of, or we can't conceive of a city without a regular water supply in the present times. And of course, in order to ensure regular water supply, you must have pump stations, you must have reservoirs, you must have water bodies from where, or river from where this city supply of water actually takes place. Similarly, electricity grids and the substations. Usually, if you travel by train and you are about to enter a city, in fact, you invariably see such grid stations, or you see such power substations on the fringes of the city. Of course, they are on the fringes of the city not only on account of security requirements or safety requirements, but also on account of the high real estate value that the land inside a city commands. So these are the physical structures which almost identify the arrival of a city to a traveler. And similarly, in ancient times, it could have been granaries and other such requirements which were absolutely essential for the survival of city dwellers. Now, since we don't have access to or we haven't been able to decipher Harappan scripts, therefore, there is not much we can say about the nomenclature of such settlements, by what name did they call such settlements, but the first reference that we have in Indian culture and history about direct references to settlements like this, which of course qualify to be referred to as towns or cities, comes from the later Vedic texts and also early Vedic references, where for instance Indra himself is referred to as Purandhar. Now, Indra, all of us know that Indra was the chief god, or the most important of the gods in Rigvedic times, and the fact that one of the names of Indra is also Purandhar, which means that he is destroyer of forts. Now, forts being referred to as Pur in early Sanskrit text, in Vedic text, and Pur is an enclosed, encircled settlement that we were just talking of. So it is quite possible that Pur, or for that matter in the later Vedic times, Nagar and so forth, started being referred to for a settlement which we today refer to as a town. So, and that also gives us some kind of an historical insight, cultural insight as to what is the popular imagery with which such settlements are identified. So, it is it is an enclosed physical structure with high walls and some kind of a killa, some kind of a huge structure. That is what is referred to as town. And that is why even in the present times we find so many of the Indian cities bearing the suffix Pur. So it is Kanpur, Nagpur and Saharanpur and so forth. Of course, they are in the present times devoid of any fort-like structure as such, but the name has stuck, and that tells us about the role of culture, the public imagination, and the kind of familiarity that we have with the word and the kind of settlement that we think of. Of course, Kanpur today is an out-and-out industrial town. It's a modern town, but the name bears this suffix Pur. So, similarly, there are several such settlements, urban settlements, which emerged in the medieval times during the Sultanate or during the Mughal period. They were born of different circumstance. Some of them were actually sarais, and sarais are the places where travelers and the traders would temporarily stay for some period of time in order to rest, because they have to travel for a longer duration of time, and there are of course some amenities for their upkeep, for their well-being, for their luxury, and that keeps developing around that structure, that is sarai. And maybe that over a period of time it has assumed the form of a city, form of a town, and therefore quite a few places, quite a few towns today also bear this suffix Sarai. So you have Mughal Sarai and so forth. So that also tells us about the basic function with which a particular city or a town actually emerged. But over a period of time, it acquired different connotations. Today, there might not be any inkling of these cities or towns serving the purpose of rest house for the travelers and so forth. They have acquired multi-functions. And this is yet another thing, this is yet another structural requirement almost for the emergence of a town that we should be talking about. Generally, we tend to believe that these settlements came into being, or as the name suggests, for a particular purpose. But for any urban center to sustain itself over a period of time, having one function or performing one function perhaps was not enough. And therefore, we find through Indian history and culture that towns which perform single function or which were intended to perform one function, unifunctional towns, could not survive the test of time. Usually, these settlements, these towns had to have or had to perform multi-functions. And in fact, a very direct kind of analogy can be made from the business strategies of several corporate houses that we get to see even today. In order to survive, because all of us are aware of the fact that business cycles keep changing, so there is high and a low in a particular business, and a corporate house has to ensure that a particular brand or a particular company survives such high and lows of business cycles. So what do they do as part of survival strategy, or maybe even as a strategy to maximize profit, is to have is to spread out into different segments of production or service, whatever as may be the case. So you have, for instance, Tatas, which emerged as maybe steel makers primarily, also got into automobiles, so much so that they also started making chai, they also started making Tata salt and so forth. This is diversification strategy, and quite a few big companies resort to this strategy. Why do they do this? They do this so that if the business cycle is at low for one particular sector of economy, say steel or automobile, then maybe the other sectors in which they have spread out kind of replenishes the losses or the lack of profit. So that is a survival strategy, and the same analogy can be drawn with reference to understanding the continuance of several towns and cities in India. And the best example that we can think of here is coming from the medieval times or the Mughal times, so to say. All of us are aware of Agra, and one contrast can be made as a kind of case study in order to see as to how a unifocal or unifunctional town fares with a multifunctional town. Now, Agra is in very close vicinity of another capital town which was purposefully made by Akbar, and that is Fatehpur Sikri. So Fatehpur Sikri as a city was actually initiated. The project was initiated by Akbar himself, and magnificent red stone buildings were made, and it's a visiting site even today, and a big revenue earner for the visitors, for the state. And we find that despite spectacular buildings and so forth, the settlement, the Fatehpur Sikri as a city, as a capital city, could not survive the test of time. Of course, historians attribute this to the endemic problem of continued water supply, which was perhaps responsible for the desertion of this particular settlement, Fatehpur Sikri. But also important is the fact that it was erected, the city itself was erected into prominence merely on account of political reasons. So it was the political thrust of Akbar which perhaps ensured its sustenance till he was around. But ever since the political prominence fell into some kind of disuse, and the political focus shifted from Fatehpur Sikri, and the town did not have in itself the wherewithals to survive the test of time, because it was all dependent on one particular aspect, and that is political prominence. Had it probably diversified into several other segments of economy, had it become a nodal point for trade and commerce like Agra did, had it been on a river bank, on a perennial river bank like Agra was, in close vicinity, perhaps the chances of survival could have been more. Had it become or had it thrown itself into history as some kind of a manufacturing center, like several other centers did, Kashi did, or had it become a part of pilgrimage circuit, religion aspect. So a city has to diversify in these functions in order to sustain itself, and if they don't do it, probably they have greater chances of not continuing into the future. So far what we spoke of is some kind of the structural requirements and the diversification in terms of performing functions for cities. Similarly, for the ancient city of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa also, we find that it is not merely the civic amenities and the structures which is so important about Mohenjo-daro. Mohenjo-daro happens to be located at a very strategic point in the total Harappan complex, and it is a nodal point for trade activities. So quite a few trade routes actually converged at or were very close to Mohenjo-daro, and trade and commerce, of course, gave a great fillip to the continuance of Mohenjo-daro as a town. So apart from that, of course, there could be the administrative prominence or some political functions, some ritual or religious value associated with the place and so forth. So they all can come together in order to give some kind of a continued support to the survival of these cities. Now, having discussed the physical component of urban centers and its pertinence to history and culture, let's also understand that this term urbanism is not only about physical structure. There are some aspects of social organization, social attitude, cultural values, and some sense attitudes, general social attitudes with which this term urbanism is identified. And as we discussed, that it kept changing over a period of time in history. For instance, let's discuss this with reference to some concrete examples. All of us know about Patliputra, the present day Patna, the capital of Bihar, and Patliputra, its ancient name, which was the capital of Magad, which went on to through the first pan-Indian empire in India in the form of the Mauryas. Around 6th century BC, when 16 Mahajanapads are very often referred to in the contemporary texts, Brahmanical as well as Buddhist texts, we find that Magad as a Janapad or Mahajanapad is fast coming up, and it has its capital at Rajgrih, the present day Rajgir, very close to Patna and Nalanda. This center was the capital of Magad, which was a Mahajanpad, to the south of the river Ganga, which can be identified as the central part of Bihar today. And across the river, that is to the north of Ganga, what today would be northern part of Bihar, we had Vaishali, yet another city which had a different kind of political setup. It was a confederacy of states. It was a republican sort of polity which was followed here, some oligarchy form of governance. And the two, in 6th century BC, the two towns were in fact the two Mahajanapadas were vying with each other for political prominence. And Vaishali was very famous. Vaishali was famed in the contemporary period on account of the presence of a very famous courtesan with which even Gautam Buddha was in touch. And her name was Amrapali. Now, Amrapali was a famous courtesan at Vaishali, and till around this time, around the time of Bimbisar and Ajatashatru, Magad or Rajgiri and subsequently Patliputra, the capital of Magad, had not been able to gain that much of prominence, and therefore the legend goes that Ajatashatru also wanted that someone equal to the glory and fame of Amrapali should be residing in Patliputra, so that the reputation of the newfound capital could match with that of Vaishali. In fact, that could be outsmarted. Although he failed in doing that, but that tells us about the attitude that ancient people had around this time with reference to cities. So cities were also identified. The point that I am making here, that cities were also identified with this cultural attribute. Maybe refinement, a set of etiquettes, behavioral quotient of the population in general, the city dwellers, and so forth. All these things probably gave some kind of a different outlook to the urban dwellers, and the pursuit of glory and so forth. And this is something which is not exclusive to Indian culture and history. In fact, if we look at European counterpart also, in the Renaissance time, that is around 16th century, 15th century, 16th century, we find that quite a few Renaissance artists actually lend lot of credence and glory through their achievements, through their fame, to the cities from where they came. So, of course, the form of such cities was different, in the sense that they were city-states where they were very free, and the state itself, the piece of land which was identified as a city was controlled by the city administration, and it was not part of a larger estate as is usually the case. But these city-states were gaining a lot of prominence and fame on account of the personal achievements of some of its outstanding city dwellers. And this cultural sense of achievement, glory, refinement, etiquettes and so forth went on to constitute what in popular perception we regard as part of urbanism. So urban centers are identified with such a set of values, with such set of patterns of behavior and so forth, and attitudes. Also important is the fact that as outlined towards the beginning of our discussion, that trade and commerce is almost an integral part of cities, because structurally cities are dependent for food, for supply of food on the hinterland or in the adjoining areas, and therefore these channels have always got to be open, and if you stop these channels, the cities won't survive. Similarly, there is heterogeneity with respect to the occupational groups that survive in a city, that thrive in a city. So there is a range of occupational pursuits. It could be jewelers, artisans, masons, professional groups like doctors, administrative people, politicians, film stars, artists, sports icons and so forth, and probably that was the case even in the earlier times. So there is fair degree of heterogeneity in the social composition of a town, and apart from the density quotient, which is very much a marker of a city, we also have the heterogeneity of the population as one of the important cultural or social markers of urban center. An urban center which could not afford to maintain its heterogeneous population with respect to, say, religion, with respect to language groups, with respect to professions, or even other pursuits, perhaps could not retain the sense of urbanism in itself. And the best example that we can cite of is the city of Shahjahanabad, which was of course initiated by Shah Jahan in the Mughal period, and this is around 17th century period that we are talking of. And let's as we did it with the case of Agra and Fatehpur Sikri, in order to understand the multifocal or the functional aspect of a city. Similarly, let's juxtapose Shahjahanabad with the subsequent city, the British Delhi, as we refer to. So, of course, when we do that, we find that Shahjahanabad, the way it was actually planned, had heterogeneity inbuilt into it. There are two different models of city planning that we get to see in the early modern and modern times, and we find that the centers for political purpose, be it the Royal Killa, the Lal Killa, or the market around it, they are all located on a particular axis, north-south and east-west axis. The different gates that we get to see, Lahori Gate and so forth, they are actually indicators of the axis on which the city was planned. And another important thing is that in the original plan of Shahjahanabad, we find that houses, the dwelling units and the marketplace are situated very close to each other, almost indistinguishable. So in terms of planning, it wasn't planned that, okay, this is the residential area, so let's segregate the market area, let's segregate the institutional area, let's segregate the recreational area and so forth. In fact, they are all combined together, and it is very difficult to distinguish a market center from a dwelling unit. So you come down from your house and you are straightway entering into a market and so forth. Similarly, the coffee houses and so forth, where people could sit together and discuss things over a cup of kava or whatever beverages, they were all indistinguishable in terms of planning. And that tells us about the kind of intensity with which people of diverse, say, cultural backgrounds interacted, and so much so that Mir Taqi Mir refers to the contemporary times of Shahjahanabad or Delhi, and he says that here different people live with each other, and they are indistinguishable, almost like verses in a poem. So there is a poetic angle, there is a harmonious coexistence that is being referred to here. And another model that we get to see in the modern times with the arrival of the British in Delhi, this is 1803 onwards, we find that the area where the British settled, which is the present day, you can say, Kashmiri Gate area, and this was the area where British Army chose to settle down, and the way they thought of the city and the way it was evolved over a period of time, even after becoming the capital city, we find that their plan of visualizing a city was a little bit different, and that's where the notion of culture comes. Their notion of a city was segregated spaces. So they thought of, say, residential houses at one place. That's how it was planned. They segregated the institutional area to other places. Market area was again distinguished from residential area. So the Connaught Place that you have is an area which is market and only market. There is no residential area here. Similarly, the habitation area would be different, and then there is, of course, heterogeneity in this also. There is hierarchy in this also. Similarly, reserve area, forest area, the ridge area, that was different. So that was reserved where other activities could not happen and so forth. So that was the modern conceptualization and attitude towards urbanism that the British brought to fore. And this segregated planning, or planning as per this spatial segregation, is something that we continue with probably in the present times, although students who do well to make themselves familiar with some new concepts about urbanism from cultural point of view and also from planning point of view. And you can watch some videos or some literature on Neo-Urbanism. Now, Neo-Urbanism is about the new way in which the cities are conceived and designed, keeping in mind, of course, not only the cultural dimension, but also the energy dissipated. We are living in an age of energy crisis, and the resources that we have for energy are fast dissipating. We have not been able to replenish it, and that is a cause of concern for several city planners. And what they are now doing is having a kind of relook at these segregated planning, spatial segregated planning of these cities. So how do we live in a city today is that suppose we live at a point, our dwelling unit is at a point, our working place is far separated from that place. For instance, I myself, in order to interact with you, came to this studio which is around 30 kilometers away from my house, and again I will have to go back. My workplace is also around 10 to 15 kilometers away from my residence, and then my market where I often keep going in order to buy groceries. There are also, of course, very minor shops are there in the vicinity in my own society, but most of the big markets and mandis are far separated in terms of space from my dwelling units. But in order to transact my life, I have to keep going to these places. The police station is far separated, the hospital is a little bit away from my place, and so but in order to live, we do require to visit these places time and again, and that consumes lot of energy. If we take automobiles, if we take public transport also, then also there's a lot of dissipation of energy in doing so. And just think of the Shah Jahanabad planning, where all these basic amenities of one's lifestyle, urban lifestyle, they are all present in the vicinity itself, and that means that one could have done without using that much of energy in order to transact a usual urban life. So it is all about culture. I mean, if one is comfortable with the idea of moving down from one's house and straightway entering into a market and so forth, if one is socialized to the idea of shor sharaba of a market and so forth, and intense intermingling with the people in the vicinity, and that can do away with the kind of atomized individuals that we have made ourselves in urban dwellings. So this neo-urbanism is about such aspects of urban life, which is in close conformity with the local culture, the habits, and also keeping in mind that it will reduce the amount of energy that is unnecessarily at times exhausted in order to transact an urban life. And that tells us about the another dimension of culture and urbanism. Also, I'll just briefly in a minute sum up that different groups in history have had different attitudes towards urban centers, and that is also a cultural kind of hangover, which is regarded as some kind of an idealized lifestyle and so forth. For instance, in the around the 6th century BC times that we spoke of, when most of the urban centers that survive in India today, like Patliputra, like Angadi, Bhagalpur, and Kashi, Banaras, and so forth, they were coming up. At around that time, if we look at the Brahmanical sources, they are very scornful of the urban lifestyle. Whereas if you look at the Buddhist and Jain sources, they are somewhat not that scornful, they are permissible of the urban lifestyle, and that has to do with the kind of rural lingerings or the agrarian lingerings that Brahmanical society displayed at that point of time. But by the time we reach the Kalidas's period, Kalidas writes with flair, and he talks probably, although he does not directly mention, but probably his imagery of a city is actually emerging from Ujjain. So although historians dispute about it as to which city he actually belonged to, which place he was writing from, nevertheless he talks of city life, aesthetics, values in laudatory terms. Similarly, in Natya Shastra, Bharat Muni's Natya Shastra, although it is again not directly explicitly mentioned, but the kind of aesthetics which is being talked about in drama and so forth actually suits a very refined, educated urban audience. So even indirectly we find that the sense of urbanism permeating in several of the writings and several of the ancient Indian sources, and so is the case with the coming of the Sultanate and Mughal period, and also the British, as we just mentioned. So that broadly gives us a kind of an idea about the cultural insight, the cultural quotient of urban life and attitude towards urban dwellers and the urbanism in general.
Thank you so much, sir, for covering the aspect in a very lucid manner and also very descriptive manner. And I'd like to tell our friends that today we have covered urbanism in Indian culture, and we shall be there with more lectures in similar topics talking about Indian culture. And with this, we would like to take leave, and also thanks, sir, for being here. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you for watching.